tell you sort of how this show is going to work tonight. It's a little bit different than what we would normally have in our regular Tuesday evening show at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. So what we're going to do tonight is we are going to watch parts of a documentary that has been created for you for numerous people that have been interviewed on this particular subject. And so what we're going to do is, the way it's going to work is we're going to ask for your comments as we're going throughout the particular program. It's going to be in 6 sections. However, we will be reading some of your comments in between those sections, and then at the end of the show, we will be taking your calls and comments, and we'll have time for discussion. So the show's going to be a little bit longer tonight. Our show is normally 1 hour, but tonight it's going to be about 2.5 hours. So buckle your seatbelt, grab a cup of whatever you'd like to drink, and get comfortable, because we'll really have a great show for you. All right, so tonight we're going to look again at the call for the restoration of deaconesses in the Orthodox Church. And I say again, and I want people in the chat box to listen to this, okay? Because there's a lot of people that think that somehow this is the first time that we're talking about it. So listen up, chat folks. We have done a program on this topic before. In the beginning of August 2023, I invited, yes, Proto-Deacon Brian Patrick Mitchell on the program to talk about his book, The Disappearing Deaconess. Now, after his presentation, we did receive feedback from those who support the movement to restore deaconesses that they were not permitted to represent their own position. So that brings us to tonight. Tonight, we have gathered together bishops, priests, scholars, historians, canonists, and thinkers who are giving their perspectives on this issue, both against and for the restoration of deaconess. To be sure, as it said at the beginning of the program, Ancient Faith Ministries' purpose is to give the teaching and propagation of the Orthodox Christian faith unadulterated and unaltered. So, we're going to watch this program and we're going to listen, and the most important thing is to respond to what is being said. That's what we have to do in this program. So, I am so happy that we are partnering with the former CEO of and founder, of course, of Ancient Faith Ministries, and that is John Maddex. John, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thank you, Father Tom, for letting me come on. This is going to be very exciting and very interesting.
You have done a tremendous amount of work on this documentary. So can you tell us a little bit about how you actually put together this documentary?
Well, it took the cooperation of really 16 different people who were willing to talk to me. And we made it clear that our purpose is not to debate, not to do combat, but to ironically talk together. So I really, first of all, want to express my appreciation to all 16 of our panelists for their patience with me as I interviewed them, and without exception, they were all gracious and generous with their time. So all of these interviews are gathered in one humongous file. It's 10 hours long. So if you're interested in a specific interview with a specific purpose or person, you can find that we'll have a timestamp where that person is located. So second, even though I know how difficult this is, I really hope our listeners will listen objectively. This is important work. And I hope we're willing to put in the effort to assume the best about the people we disagree with. There's enough polarization already in our church, which has been fed by the vitriol of social media. And I'm not asking anybody to be dispassionate. I'm just asking you to think about your fellow Orthodox Christians in the same way Christ thinks about them. And then finally, even though I tried hard to present a balanced production, there is no doubt that people on both sides of this disagreement are going to feel that I failed in that attempt. And I just want to apologize to anyone that I have offended or disappointed. We really wanted to listen and listen respectfully. So it was a fascinating, I learned so much, and I'm so appreciative of everyone who gave me so much of their time.
Thanks, John. And I also wanted to say that you and I talked over the questions that you were going to ask to each panelist, and the questions were formulated in such a way because we knew possibly where they stood on certain issues, and so we wanted to ask them quite frank questions. Is that correct?
Oh, it is correct, and I would say that to a person. They were very patient and respectful in answering those questions. So I'm just very pleased with the deportment of every one of them. They were respectful and very patient.
I want to ask you one. This is an important question, okay? Because there has been some things have been said about ancient faith, and of course, I've been with you almost from the beginning. I believe in Ancient Faith Ministries. I believe that it is a venerable ministry. I want to ask you flat out, okay? Are we promoting deaconesses tonight on this program?
Absolutely not. That's not our purpose. That's not why we put in the time for this. What we did want to do is learn to find out from the source what is the reason. Why is this being sought? And what can we learn about what is being sought? And rather than immediately demonize, let's listen a little bit more and demonize quite a bit less, if at all. And so... Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, the title here, The Orthodox Deaconess, examining the call for restoration. That's the whole point, right? We're just examining what is being asked for, examining, analyzing, answering, refuting, whatever, point of view somebody has. That's what's happening tonight. I want to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. Does Ancient Faith Ministries have a hidden, subversive agenda to undermine the teaching of the Orthodox faith?
If that was the case, I would have never in my wildest imagination wanted to start a ministry like Ancient Faith. I came to the Orthodox faith because I believed lock, stock, and barrel in the teaching of the Church that has been handed down through the centuries. I am in no position to disagree with what the Church teaches. And I can tell you, in the years that I was involved before my retirement, there were certainly some controversial moments. But in every respect, it was the clear teaching of the Church that guided us. And all of those years, we have been under the spiritual authority of the Antiochian Orthodox Church of North America, whether through Metropolitan Philip at the beginning, Metropolitan Joseph, and now Metropolitan Saba. They are fully aware of what we do, why we do it, and they have been very supportive, including of this project. They have heard every word of the production, and they have put their stamp on it as something that they are proud to have represent them. So I just want people to know what our heart is here, and it's okay that people disagree. It's okay that people have strong, passionate views about things, but all I can tell you is at the heart of what we're trying to do is to spread the truth of the Orthodox faith in a clear and compelling way.
Okay, quick reminder. If you want to make comments, go ahead. The chat room is open on YouTube and on Facebook, so you're welcome to go ahead and chat there. Also, you can send us a text message anytime, 412-206-5012. We would love to hear from you. As I said, at the end of the program, we'll take your calls. We're not going to do that right now. We'll talk about it later. John, kick us off.
All right, so our presentation is in 6 parts. Our first part is going to be about the history of the deaconesses in the Orthodox Church and the rank of orders. Part 2, we'll learn about the call for restoring the female diaconate. Where does the call come from? What was the 1988 Rhodes Consultation all about? Third, is the call for restoration a true restoration, or is this something new? Some would use the term innovation or enhancement. And so we'll examine what is being called for, how does it compare with what was actually the role of the deaconess in history. Part 4, what I call the elephant in the room, the female priesthood. Some say that ordaining female deacons creates a slippery slope that would lead to female priests. Are there theological reasons why this should never happen? Are there traditional reasons why this should never happen? And we'll hit that head on. Number 5, the need for deaconesses. Why do we need deaconesses today? What was their role in the past, and how does that come to be a need in the present? And so we'll look at the need for deaconesses. And finally, the role of unity, the need for us to stay together as Orthodox Christians. And we'll also conclude with some other observations that I hope people will find interesting as well. So part 1, the history and the rank of orders.
Very good.
The Orthodox Deaconess, examining the call for restoration. Hello, I'm John Maddex, and thanks for listening to our in-depth examination of the call for restoration of the female diaconate. So, why are we doing this? Well, our goal is to provide a forum for responsible, respectful discussion that furthers our mission to educate, edify, and evangelize at Ancient Faith. And while we never intend to present material that is not in line with the teachings of the Orthodox Church, there are topics where the Church does not have a unified stated position, and this is true of our topic today. People have conflicting opinions about the history and function of the female diaconate and whether that role should be restored today. So, in light of that, you need to know that we at Ancient Faith do not necessarily endorse all of the statements you're about to hear. Let's get started. Part 1. History and the rank of orders. It would be interesting to do a poll to discover how many Orthodox Christians knew that there is a factual history of deaconesses in the early and Byzantine Church. But there is very little debate surrounding the reality of female deacons in the New Testament and the early Church. Pittsburgh Theological Seminary New Testament scholar Dr. Edith M. Humphrey gives us a brief overview of the office of deaconess, beginning with how widespread this was in the early Church.
So certainly the female diaconate was not universal in history, but it was found in certain prominent places like Constantinople, and it was certainly more prominent in the East than in the West. It died out quite quickly in the West, and the reasons for that are a little obscure, but in the East it continued, and we have some very good evidence for that, including our dear golden-mouthed saint, St. John Chrysostom, who speaks with fondness about a particular deaconess. So we do have historical precedents for it. There are gaps in the historical evidence, but silence doesn't mean that women deacons didn't exist. Sometimes we just assume because we don't hear about it that it wasn't going on there. In some cases, their role may have been taken for granted. There was no controversy, so there was no need to talk about it. We have various indications that there was some debate and some controversy as to what women deacons should do. There are some very early documents that talk about their role And there are some canons that regulate the role, not all of which agree with each other. And there are some prominent theologians like Origen and Chrysostom and Clement of Alexandria and Theodoret, who all talk about women deacons and trace them right back to the apostolic witness, to the New Testament.
Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost is the chair of the St. Phoebe Center for Deaconesses and an Orthodox scholar with a doctorate in theology, ethics, and culture from the University of Virginia.
So we have many sources from the first 1,000 or so years of Christian history that validate and also illuminate the ordained order of deaconess. And this is, of course, really important for us as Orthodox Christians because we, as you may have noticed, place a great deal of value on precedent and our history. We have scripture. We have St. Paul telling us of the deaconess Phoebe in his letter to the Romans. And the orders of the clergy were not fully formed by Paul's time, but the Orthodox Church understands Phoebe to be a member of what later developed into the ordained ministry of the diaconate. We also have all manner of textual and architectural and material culture evidence about deaconesses. There's been a great deal of excellent scholarship done in the last 50 or 100 years or so. We have inscriptions from the ancient world. We have things like tombstones that refer to women as deaconesses. We have, of course, deaconess saints on our church calendar. We have canons of the church that mention things like requirements for deaconesses. And we also have the service from the 8th century that was used to ordain deaconesses. And so from this evidence, all this different evidence, and of course I'm being brief here and just giving an overview, there's much more, we see not only a witness to the fact that there were deaconesses in the ancient world, but we're also given a picture of how deaconesses ministered in different times and different places.
The translation of the term St. Paul uses to refer to Phoebe is clearly deacon, even though at its root the word connotes servant. Orthodox theologian, scholar, and professor Dr. John Panagiotou.
When you look at the original Greek, the words ousan diakonon, okay, being the female deaconess or the female deacon or female servant. Let's get to the root of what diakonos means. It literally means a servant. You know, someone literally, even if we were going to go deeper, and I know in our American context especially, we don't like to use this phrase, but it literally means beyond servanthood. It means a slave, someone who, in the sense, is sold out to God. So a servant who has so much devotion to the Lord. In this word, diakonon, and even when it's taken in the accusative, it means a servant nearly, from diakonos, it means nearly all of its 30 uses in the New Testament. But it refers especially to church offices of deacon.
Noted author, theologian, and scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantino would go even further in acknowledging Phoebe in a defined ministerial role.
We have to set aside our personal opinions and just look at the historical record.
Okay.
And St. Paul, in chapter 16, because men have said, there are a lot of men who are opposing the female diaconate, and they said, well, there were never female deacons. And Paul calls her deacon, diakonos. Well, they say, well, that was a minister. Protestants say this often too, some Protestants. So they will say, well, she wasn't really a deacon. She was a minister or she was a servant. But let's just look at that passage there, because Paul calls her diakonos. And then he lists a lot of women in chapter 16 of Romans who are doing a lot of work in that church. He doesn't call any one of them diakonos. Okay? He says, greet Mary who has worked hard among you. If he meant to say that Phoebe was just somebody who was serving the church, I don't think he would have used that term, because he never uses that term for all these other women whom he applauds and commends for all the work they're doing in the church. And he calls one of them apostolos. The Junia is an apostle. So the point is, she was clearly a diakonos. She was a female deacon. So let's not try to say that she was something else, because I also find it rather offensive when men assume that, oh, she can't be really a deacon, but anytime that word is mentioned, because they'll say, well, Paul calls himself a servant. Yeah, but whenever that word is used for a man, we don't say, well, he wasn't really a deacon. He was just a servant. So let's be consistent and let's be fair when we're analyzing these texts.
We also know that there were female deacons in the early church who served in important roles, as the number of adult baptisms outweighed the number of infant baptisms. And, believe it or not, early church baptisms had the newly illumined converts baptized in the nude. For the sake of propriety, deaconesses assisted the female converts behind a screen.
Even with a presbyter or a bishop baptizing people, individuals being males of the clergy and the hierarchy, it was out of propriety that a woman would go, a godly woman would go into the waters, and as the prayers are being read, the woman is baptizing the female catechumen, who's to the newly illumined, and she was doing the anointing in its purest form. This was an act between a woman ministering to a woman that could not be perceived as anything either visually or inappropriately close, we'll say through touching, that the priest or the bishop would have anything to do with. So this was a ministry unto a baptism.
Very early, other duties were included, according to popular author and podcaster Father Stephen DeYoung.
Probably the earliest complete outline of what deacon women did comes from a document called the Didaskalia Apostolorum, which means the teaching of the apostles in sort of Latinized Greek. Right? And it's basically like a church order manual from the very early 3rd century. It's probably written about 215, AD 215. And chapter 16 of that document is all about deaconesses. But in sort of summary, the bishop needs to choose and appoint deacons. And then at the beginning of chapter 16, it says, a man for the performance of most things that are required, but a woman for the ministry of women. So the male deacon is the deacon as we know it, but there is this other role. There's this particular ministry to the women of the church for which the deacon women, the deaconesses, are appointed. And this is not just, this does have to do with baptism. As people have pointed out, sometimes people were baptized in the nude, right? Women going to the water. But it wasn't just that. It was also women who were involved in teaching younger women, who were involved in the visitation of the sick for women, because it was considered unseemly for male clergy to go and visit a woman privately in her home. And a number of these elements have survived, right? There are female monastics, for example, who have a blessing to hear confessions from women. They don't give absolution, but they hear the confession. And they're involved in catechizing women who are coming into the church. And all of these things are enumerated there already at the beginning of the 3rd century. So it was this functional and practical thing of there's this ministry to women, and you need to select particular women of a particular kind of character, right, who are older women, long in the faith, and designate them to be the ones to carry out this ministry to other women, and using this minor order to establish this is the woman who I'm entrusting this to.
There is not complete agreement among our panelists about the nature of the ordinations of deaconesses in the history of the Orthodox Church. Were they actual ordinations as we understand them today, as in what are called major orders, deacon, priest, bishop, or were they more akin to tonsuring of a reader or consecrating a subdeacon?
So we know that in the early church there were 2 levels of clergy. The lower orders of clergy, in which somebody was given a blessing by the bishop, and that is called hierothesia. Hierothesia, the laying on of hands. So those are things like subdeacon and the readers and chanters today, but there were also people who literally were responsible for the doors of the church, doorkeepers and exorcists, and we had an order of widows in the early church, and things like this. Then you have the higher, what are called higher orders of clergy, and those are ordained orders, and the word for that is hierotonia, and that's an ordination. There is a difference there. And we know that women were ordained in the sanctuary as a deacon and at the holy altar by the bishop. And they would receive communion directly from the chalice and replace it on the holy altar, which was a sign that they were among what we would call today the higher orders of clergy.
Dr. Valerie Karas, patristic theology scholar and retired professor of Byzantine and early church history, agrees. She bases that largely on the 8th century Barberini Codex, which she says provides the ordination rite for both male and female deacons.
And the Barberini 336 Codex has this basically the same ordination rite that we see in later Evangelize as well for the female deacon. And that rite follows the male deacon's rite. In fact, most of the Evangelize say something along the lines as do it like the male deacons, and then it will list, what the differences are. So it doesn't even bother to give like a full separate ordination rite. And the differences are minor. They have to do with things that I think largely come from either propriety. So the female deacon does not kneel before the bishop. The bishop does not kiss the female deacon like he does the male deacon. Or in terms of the nature of her ministry, she does not have, in the Byzantine era at any rate, a public liturgical ministry.
Father Lucas Christensen is a PhD candidate at Notre Dame, exploring the sacred arts, including ritual. And as it relates to that Barberini Codex, he sees it more ambiguously, saying it could imply major orders, but not necessarily.
I don't see in Barberini a specific mention of where the ordination of the deaconess took place. The confusion may come from the early rubric, which tells us, when we look at that, and it's very similar to the rubric for the ordination of the deacon, after the Holy Anaphora and after the opening of the doors, before the deacon says all of the saints, or we would have it having commemorated all the saints, right? The one to be ordained is presented to the bishop and intoned the divine grace, which is a shorthand for the whole prayer. And then she bows her head, and he places his hand upon her head and makes the sign of the cross 3 times, and then prays, and then it includes the prayer. Okay, well, where's the mention that she enters the altar? We know that the doors are open. It could be the holy doors of the altar area if they were closed during the anaphora, although we don't know that. I'm not aware that it has to be interpreted as the doors of the altar area. It could be the doors of the church closed at the time of the anaphora. But even if it is the doors of the altar area, we're not told, this is sort of an indication of the timing of the prayer. We're not told that she enters into the doors of the altar area. We're also not told the deacon does. Okay, so I'm trying to be very careful in the way that I say this. It doesn't mean she didn't, but it also doesn't necessarily say she does. What it does say about the deacon that it doesn't say about the deaconess at this point is that he kneels. And we know in at least the received practice, when he kneels at the altar, whereas she simply bows the head. And so this is one of those differences that if this is an ordination equivalent to that of the diaconate, you would expect that the ritual practice would also be exercised the same, and we don't see that.
Dr. Edith Humphrey agrees that we should not be too dogmatic about that, given the conflicting uses of terms throughout history.
So are they to be considered part of the equivalent of a deacon and therefore part of the 3 higher orders? Or are we talking more about a tonsure, a kind of appointment in which they would be somewhere around the level of subdeacon or reader? If we want to talk about levels in the church, that's problematic in itself. Yeah, so the problem is different words are used, right? Yeah. So were these words always being consistently used to mean different things? No. So we really don't know.
One thing that is clear from the early canons when talking about deaconesses is that they were to remain celibate without exception. according to Orthodox patristic scholar Father Joseph Lucas.
The deaconesses always had to remain celibate. They either had to be a virgin or they had to be a widow, and they would, if they remarried or had any sexual relations after their ordination to deaconess, they were deposed. So there's very strict rules about that. So it was a celibate ministry, which tells you it's very different than what was expected of the male deacons, and probably has to do with something about the roles that they played within the church. And those were sexually differentiated roles. They had different purposes because the church understood that male and female are distinct. They're different. And therefore, the way that these ministries were going to operate was based in that kind of complementarity between male and female and what they were called to do.
Coming up in Part 2, we'll learn about the current call for the restoration of the female diaconate today. Stay tuned.
Okay, John. So here's what I heard. This first part is the history. And it seems to me like this is kind of the low-hanging fruit of the issue, right? This is the stuff that you can fairly easily discern. Now, there were several of the people that said, we're not really sure if they were ordained in a particular way or not. They, for instance, women did not kneel at the altar. They did not, the manner of ordination was much different. And then it was mentioned that they were always celibate, and they were highly restricted to the ministering to women. Did I kind of get that right?
Yeah. And, I always prefer things black and white, but the reality of history is often unsatisfying, at least in that regard. And I found the discussion about the so-called Barberini Codex fascinating. Obviously, those in favor of restoration need to be able to show the existence of ancient rites of ordination to major orders, and this document does appear to do that. And we even had Dr. Jeannie Constantino supporting that claim, even though she does not favor restoration today. But I also felt a compelling case was made by some of our scholars that we shouldn't be too dogmatic about that, giving conflicting practices in history. So my takeaway, history is ambiguous. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I'm not frankly sure it's all that important.
Yeah, the only other thing that I sort of didn't hear was the lack of universality of this particular office, right? Maybe a more of a historical context about when this was. And so I'm assuming that, the big file that's going to be put out, maybe some of that information is in there.
Oh, yeah. So we're talking 10 hours compared to an hour and 45 minutes. So, yes. In that regard, listen to Dr. Edith Humphrey's complete interview on that. Listen to Dr. Valerie Karas's complete interview, and they will not agree. And Dr. Jeannie Constantino will be somewhere in the middle of that. So it is interesting that, we don't have full agreement, and even among those who would not favor restoration, there is not full agreement because, again, you're dealing with history which can be messy. I think the important part is their function. And this is where there is going to be serious disagreement in Part 3. We're going to have Part 2 in a second, but in Part 3, listen for the differences of opinion on the function then compared with what is being called for today. Sure. And I know people have already come to their own conclusions about what we're going to say about that, but you may be surprised.
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that, this did die out, and it was a very limited function. And I think we have to keep that in mind. All right, what is next?
All right, the next is the call. This is a shorter piece, a shorter segment, and it has to do with the Rhodes Conference 36 years ago. And so we'll hear about that conference, and we'll also get some thoughts from panelists who want to know what happened since then.
All right, here we go.
Part 2, The Call. In 2013, The St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess was initiated and was dedicated to educating Orthodox faithful on the history of the ordained female diaconate and exploring revival of this role for the upbuilding of the Church today. Just recently, the St. Phoebe Center celebrated 10 years of this exploration with an event at Holy Cross Hellenic College in Brookline, Massachusetts. There were a variety of speakers and panels, including keynote remarks by the chair of the St. Phoebe Center, Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost.
Around the same time that conversation happened with my hometown priest, the Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios I convened a consultation in Rhodes, Greece in 1988 with representatives from 12 of the autocephalous Orthodox churches. The purpose of this gathering, which we now refer to as the Rhodes Consultation, was to consider the place of women in the Orthodox Church. The document produced at the consultation urged the Orthodox Church to ordain deaconesses once again. I quote, "The Apostolic Order of Deaconess should be revived. Such a revival would represent a positive response to many of the needs and demands of the contemporary world in many spheres." End quote. We hear in this short quotation from the Rhodes Consultation document 3 themes. First, history. The Order of Deaconess is part of the venerable history of the Orthodox Church. Second, a call. The Rhodes Consultation calls upon the Orthodox Church to revive the Order of Deaconesses for today. And third, need. We hear this word need. The Orthodox Church needs the ministry of deaconesses today.
So, what was the Rhodes Consultation in 1988? It was a gathering convened by then Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios I for what some call the first expression in the modern era for reviving the role of deaconesses. It was convened in response to a request coming from the Third Preconciliar Conference held in 1986 in Chambasset, Switzerland. That conference proposed a study of the, quote, issue of the ordination of women in order to promote relevant Orthodox doctrine in all her dialogues with Christian churches and confessions, proceeding with the ordination of women, end quote. The consultation, however, reaffirmed the male character of the sacramental priesthood, citing several, quote, ecclesiastically rooted positions, which they went on to list. You can find them online. That was 36 years ago, causing author and speaker Frederica Matthews Green to ask, what happened?
Nothing happened. There wasn't a response of a yearning for female deacons arising throughout the whole church, lay people and parish clergy, hierarchs, monastics. If the Holy Spirit wanted this to happen, wouldn't there be a hunger for it all through the church? Even all around the world, we would see people saying, we long for a return of the female diaconate. The monks on Mount Athos would be demanding it. Elders, living saints everywhere would be saying, yes, we greet this with joy. We want this to happen. And that just didn't happen. But it could have, if it was the Holy Spirit's will. And maybe it could happen sometime.
We asked Dr. James Skedros from the Holy Cross Orthodox School of Theology and Hellenic College if he could cite any progress toward actualizing the call for restoration of deaconesses at the Rhodes Consultation.
So I'm glad you referenced the 88 Rhodes Consultation. It is a pretty watershed moment, at least in this conversation about the role of the female diaconate. And I think it's important for folks, if they have the opportunity, to at least get a sense of what was said at that conference. In particular, to your question about sort of movement post-88 Rhodes Consultation in America, it seems to me that there certainly has been some legs, but I'm not so sure that those legs have materialized outside of sort of pockets. So I'm thinking, first of all, I don't think this is a direct result of the Rhodes Conference, but a couple of publications that have come out of North American scholars. Kidiaki Fitzgerald's book that she published in 1998 on the women deacons in the Orthodox Church, Father John Chrysavis, who published a book in 2009 on the diaconate, really focusing exclusively on the male diaconate. But the title of the book, Remembering and Reclaiming Diaconia, really was an attempt to rethink or at least reintroduce the Orthodox world, especially the English-speaking in North America, to the diaconate. But in addition to those sort of academic pieces that have kind of popularized or made accessible the conversation of the diaconate post Rhodes consultation, I think clearly the establishment of the St. Phoebe Center, certainly in 2013, and then also in 2014, when St. Catherine's Vision, an organization of women theologians that had been in existence prior to 2014, but they came out with their statement on the rejuvenation or a call for the rejuvenation for the ministry of the ordained deaconess. I think that is also showing some traction, some energy, some movement forward. But these are all movements or responses or actions on the lay level. So in that sense, I would say, yes, I think there has been. On the official ecclesial level, I don't see really much of anything.
And St. Phoebe Center Chair Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost responded this way when I asked her about the progress toward heeding the call of the Rhodes consultation.
Now, I know people who attended Rhodes in 1988, and they left that consultation thinking that there would be deaconesses within a year. So on the one hand, there's been some disappointment and a feeling that the church has kind of kicked the can down the road. But on the other hand, I would say so much has changed and happened since the Rhodes consultation. We have more and more clergy and laity around the world supporting having deaconesses in the church again. The St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and it's evident to us that our work on education about the history and need for deaconesses is bearing fruit as more people join us. There's growing hierarchical interest and support. Metropolitan Callistos Ware was a founding advisory board member of the St. Phoebe Center, and both the current and previous ecumenical patriarchs have encouraged the church to do this again, to have deaconesses again. The process of having deaconesses again has already started in Africa. Since 2017, several women have been consecrated as deaconesses there, and there are plans to ordain women in the future. And so combine all of this and other things as well with the fact that women's roles have increased in the church in the last 36 years. I've been Orthodox my entire life, and it's been really fascinating for me through my 50 years to watch women step into all sorts of roles in significant numbers, really for the first time in Orthodox history. So I'm talking about things like readers, chanters, parish council and diocesan leaders, iconographers, scholars of different types, seminary teachers, and so on. So seeing women naturally step into these roles, I think, has woken up the church to the possibility of once again having ordained deaconesses. And all this makes me think that the Rhodes consultation, as well as other efforts of the late 20th century, set into motion something. It set into motion a movement that I believe will ultimately culminate in the ordination of deaconesses and what I hope is the not too distant future.
When we come back, we'll take a deeper dive into what is being proposed today as an attempt to answer the call from that consultation in Rhodes. Stay tuned.
All right. So that's the end of the second section, and that was specifically about this Rhodes conference, right?
Yeah.
Here's what this is really what I got out of this. Basically, this call went out, nothing happened, and I don't want to call out the St. Phoebe Center here, but I do want to say I get a sense that Dr. Frost was saying, oh, we have, this person and that person and this support for this, but everyone else is basically saying, including the bishops and the priests, there's really very little interest in this. And it seems to be almost a non-issue, except in Alexandria, where there was this very vague blessing of something, but it certainly wasn't the classic deaconess that you might have heard in the first few centuries of the church.
Yeah, and I guess I did find the attempt to demonstrate progress toward actualizing that Rhodes call a bit strained, to be honest. My sense is that there is disappointment on the part of the proponents over the lack of progress. And for the opponents, it kind of makes their point that the bishops don't they don't view it as a top priority.
Yeah, and that's, I'm watching the chat here on YouTube, and most of them are probably not even listening to the documentary. But right now, they had a lot of support for some of them, being against the diaconate, the female diaconate, and they're not listening. And now they're not trying to engage with the reality that, just like Jeannie Constantinu said, this thing, if the Holy Spirit wanted this, it would be happening, and it's not happening.
Yeah, and I think part 3 coming up is perhaps the most important segment. Well, they're all pretty important, I think, but this one, I think, will be very revealing in terms of what is being proposed and whether or not we're looking at a restoration or something different. So, again, I know how tempting it is to draw your conclusions, just by listening to a portion of it, and I know some of you have made your minds up even before you started to listen, and I get it. But please, listen to the whole thing and see if there is something there that you can pick up that would be of benefit, maybe to your perspective that you hadn't thought of before. So, restoration or innovation, that's the title of the next part.
All right, here we go.
We're back with part 3 of the Orthodox Deaconess. And in this section, we want to focus on both the historic function of the deaconess as well as how the call for the restoration of deaconesses today compares to the historic function. And you'll find that this is where disagreements really begin. We've already heard about how the deaconess functioned in the past, specifically to assist women converts who were baptized in the nude, to maintain order in the section of the nave where women and children gathered in the divine services, to bring the pre-sanctified Eucharist to women who were unable to attend the liturgy due to age or disability, and here a female was needed due to the concern for impropriety in having a male visit them in their homes. They also assisted in catechizing the female candidate for baptism, again, for propriety's sake. But how does that compare with the call to restore the female diaconate today? I asked Dr. Valerie Karras that question.
Personally, I think they should be more or less identical to the male deacons. Our society does not segregate men and women socially or in most other ways. I don't think we have, at least explicitly, the same notions that you often see in antique and Byzantine literature about women being weak. And, there's a lot of that stuff going on back then. I think we know better now.
I spoke to St. Phoebe Chair Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost about what appears to be a different, more liturgical role when they envision a restored female diaconate. Without denying that this is included in their proposed guidelines for female deacons today, she preferred to concentrate on the role of service. Some of the functions that we currently associate with a male deacon today include serving at the altar, doing the litanies during divine liturgy, reading the gospel in the liturgy, bringing the Eucharist and giving the Eucharist in the liturgy to the faithful, processing at the little and great entrances, etc. Do these same functions fit your vision of the restored deaconess?
Well, the heart of the diaconate, of the order of deacon or deaconess, is service. This was true in the ancient world. The diaconate was a service ministry that was about caring for the members of the community. caring for the poor, making sure that the church's resources were shared with those in need, and so on. And I believe that this service ministry is what is so sorely needed today in the church. Today, the role of the male deacon has often been reduced to little more than a liturgical helper. This is what many of us see, even if we see deacons at all. This is a reduction of the fullness of the order that the whole diaconate had, that was about diaconia, that was about service. The Orthodox Church would greatly benefit from a revival of the whole diaconate, male and female, with this authentic emphasis on service. Now, to speak to liturgical matters, we certainly have examples of deaconesses involved in liturgical things, processing in the liturgy, deaconess nuns reading of the gospel. And as the Orthodox Church today moves through a discernment process of what the roles of deaconesses might be, we will need to collectively decide what kind of liturgical roles a deaconess might have or not have. But any emphasis on liturgical roles, I think, misses the larger point, because the Orthodox Church needs a revival of the entire diaconate because of the good that could be generated by reviving the service ethos of this ministry.
The St. Phoebe Center has published proposed guidelines for how a restoration would work in our time, and there they are very specific about a model for the deaconess that would pretty much replicate the current liturgical function of male deacons. Quote, "These would include all of the liturgical functions in which male deacons serve. For example, a deaconess could offer petitions, sense during Vespers and Orthros, read the Gospel within the liturgy, join in processions, small entrance, great entrance, vesperal entrances, etc., help with preparing the holy gifts, give sermons during the liturgy, help with giving communion to the faithful, and take the sacrament of communion to those who are ill or confined to their homes." End quote. So, as you can imagine, our panel has divergent views about the role of a revived female diaconate, if indeed it was to be revived. The St. Phoebe Center sees a need and envisions a certain model, while other members of our panel say this looks more like innovation.
These various contemporary roles that are being suggested for the woman deacon by this document actually lean on the word extension, right? This is supposed to be, they say, an expression and an extension of the role. Well, these are certainly extensions, and they see this as possible because they understand that a lot of the limitations that were placed on women deacons in the past had to do with cultural context, and we no longer are in that cultural context. This is not saying we're looking at the past and we're reclaiming it. This is saying we're looking at the past and we are adapting it to our situation today. And whether that is legitimate or helpful is a question.
That was Dr. Edith M. Humphrey, and Dr. Jeannie Constantinou would agree.
Well, let's say that we were talking about restoring the female diaconate. We have to understand what that meant. Okay. What was their role? And their role was not like what male deacons have liturgically in the church. So we would be talking about a very limited role, which is specifically directed to the care of women. It wasn't the same as the male deacon, even though they had the term deacon. Phoebe was a deacon, diakonos. That's a masculine ending. She didn't function the same way as male deacons did. So I don't believe that what women today are looking for in the restoration of the diaconate is to do exactly the same thing. And as a matter of fact, some of the women who advocate for this say it won't be the same. It will be a modern or updated version. Now we're talking about innovation.
Father Joseph Lucas sees a problem with calling for restoration based on historical context.
Anytime we speak of restoration, it's always fraught with major problems because it's a type of archaeology. It's like it's going through texts, it's looking at little references here and there and trying to recreate something, but it's impossible to see the whole picture. It's impossible to know all the little facets of this and how it was actually practiced So it's not really a living tradition within the Byzantine or Chalcedonian churches. It's not something that we can look to and say, oh, but this part of Russia or this part of Greece has maintained this in exactly the same form for the last 1,000 years. So we can kind of look to that. We're actually recreating it from texts, and that always leads to concerns for how it's going to be recreated and whether it's authentic or not. When you ignore the original context, the original canons, original descriptions, you're really creating something new. You're not restoring anything.
Dr. Valerie Karras acknowledges that the proposed role is different liturgically than the historic role of deaconesses, but cites examples in more recent times of the deaconess role in the non-Chalcedonian Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Church.
And then it was revived in the 19th century, and in that revival, they made the female deacons equivalent to the male deacons. So they are vested the same way. They serve all the same functions liturgically. And more recently, we've seen them also expanding it in terms of making the requirements for ordination more the same, so that I believe there are at least a couple of female deacons in the Armenian Apostolic Church who are married. And so we've seen now in the Armenian Apostolic Church a revival that has produced a female diaconate that is serving the same functions and operating under basically the same qualifications.
And by the way, we did speak offline with a priest in the Armenian Church who told us that there are currently only 2 cases of deaconesses within the Armenian Church, one in Constantinople and one in Tehran. However, it is not widely practiced, and there is no canonical or official restoration of the practice within the Armenian Church. The story of Saint Nectarios is an interesting one, according to Dr. Karras.
Saint Nectarios, when he ordained a couple of women as deacons in the women's monastery he founded on Aegina, had them do petitions. That was, I think, one of the major reasons why he restored that order, so that they could have a fuller life.
Are you saying
life.
That Saint Nectarios ordained female deacons to do the litanies like a male deacon does today?
Exactly.
And what is your source for that? I mean, that's very interesting.
It's in his own letters. And in fact, you see him sort of trying to backpedal in a sense, because what happened, even though here he is, it's just in this women's monastery, but apparently word got out. And so some people raised a big fuss with the Archbishop of Athens. And the Archbishop asked him, what was he doing? And he said, oh, well, no, they're really more like subdeacons. And, but subdeacons have never done litanies. They don't read petitions, right? I think what he was saying to try to keep from having the Archbishop of Athens come down on him conflicts with what he actually did, which was to follow the ordination rite that we have from the Evangelize.
It's really hard to know if the Venerable Saint was trying to cover up his actual practice by saying they were only subdeaconesses. We do know that he was under intense pressure from Metropolitan Theoklitos, who was making life very hard for him. This is explicitly brought out in the wonderful film Man of God, which I'm sure many of you have seen. So I contacted Metropolitan Cleopas of Sweden, who wrote one of the most definitive theses on the life of Saint Nectarios. He did respond and was kind enough to send me a PDF copy of that work. In it, he has an interesting footnote describing an interview with a nun who spent her childhood years at the monastery in Aegina. She spoke of the method the saint used to choose women for the role of what she called subdeaconesses. And while I didn't see in Metropolitan Cleopas' thesis any evidence of a more liturgical role like we see today with male deacons, that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. So back to the matter of restoration or enhancement in the call for deaconesses today and how that compares to the historical practice. Father Stephen DeYoung says the reality probably doesn't make either side in our discussion completely happy.
You want to talk about their liturgical role. There was only one actual thing. They did stand behind the iconostasis, not at the altar. And that was sort of an across-the-board thing, because when I talked about the Empress receiving the Eucharist, I mentioned it was behind the iconostasis. I didn't say at the altar. The Emperor received communion at the altar because the consecrated Emperor was seen as having a sort of office, a sort of ordained office. It was sort of an extra ecclesiastical ordained office. He received the Eucharist at the altar. The Empress received it behind the iconostasis, but not at the altar. That seems to have been the case for the deaconess as well. When the other clergy bring the chalice and the paten, bring the gifts to the bishop who is standing at the holy doors, and give them to him, and he does his commemorations. When he was done with his commemorations over the chalice, he would hand the chalice to the deaconess, and she would set it on the altar. That is the one liturgical function that a deaconess had in terms of the divine liturgy. It was only at the hierarchical liturgy, because if there's not a bishop, then you don't have that moment. The priest brings the gifts directly to the altar. So that's a different, see, that deaconess role, even where you talk about that one liturgical role, that's different than what the male deacon is, because that means the male deacon is part of the great entrance, whereas the deaconess remained behind the iconostasis for the great entrance, right? So it's different, right? So the one side is kind of dissatisfied with that history because they want there to be no women behind the iconostasis and no liturgical role for a deaconess, and et cetera, et cetera. The other side is upset about it because it's very clearly completely different than what the male deacon is. But that's the case.
While much of the more recent exploration surrounding the call for restoration comes within the Greek Archdiocese, with the recent St. Phoebe Center Conference having the blessing and greeting of Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, as well as the GOA Archbishop Elpidophoros, I wanted to find out from other corners of the Orthodox world if they have been discussing it, or if they have deaconesses. I was pleased to be able to speak with His Eminence the Most Reverend Saba, Antiochian Archbishop of New York and Metropolitan of all of North America.
Now we don't have, but there are some voices who want to have a deaconess, but they wait and they study, because we should know what the function of the deaconess was in the first centuries of the church. This is the first point. Second point, we should know well and very well why we have no deaconess after the 5th century, and completely we have no after the 9th, 10th centuries. Why this ministry was stopped. The third point also, we should know very well why we need and we want deaconess now. Do we need deaconess now because we want to activate the pastoral ministry in the church? Because our complicated society needs many new ministries, many workers in the field of God, or because we are motivated or influenced by the humanistic movements which are everywhere now and in all the media. The motivation which is behind this ministry in the church is very, very important. We should do everything in the church, whatever we need, whatever we want, we should be done by a pure mind and loyal to the faith and to the Orthodox tradition.
And while we didn't request interviews or comments from every bishop in North America, the several that we did contact were either not available to speak with us or deferred to an archbishop. However, Metropolitan Nicholas of Rokor did bless mitred priest Alexander Lebedev, to speak on his behalf, so I took the opportunity to ask him about a report I had heard of an exploration of restoring deaconesses in Russia in the previous century.
Not from anything that I've seen or heard, and although Professor Troitsky in his article quotes extensively from the discussions of the pre-conciliar meetings that took place in preparation for an all-Russian council. These meetings took place between 1905 and I believe 1907, and the question of deaconesses did come up, and that question was brought up before the Holy Synod, and it was tabled. No resolution was made on that issue. And when the final council did open in 1917, it coincided with the beginning of the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. And so, although the council met over a period of 2 years, that was a very, very turbulent time. They did not make any decision regarding the reinstitution of the order of deaconesses.
We'll take another break now, but when we return, we'll examine what may be the elephant in the room. What is it? Stay tuned to find out.
That was really very, very interesting. And I just had a couple of comments. Number one, when it was said that subdeacons never do petitions. I worked in many Antiochian churches, and I know that subdeacons did do petitions. I don't know if that was an American thing or not, but I have seen that before. Number two, the issue about St. Nectarius. This is very common in women's monasteries. When I serve up at the women's monastery in Elwood City, there is a woman behind the altar, but you know, she doesn't have a liturgical role. She gets the censer. She, you know, helps with whatever I need as the priest, but she doesn't have a kind of liturgical role. And then I really appreciated His Eminence Metropolitan Saba's comments, especially about, you know, the idea that there are so many things for women to do, and that this should not be about power or, you know, out of politics or anything like that. I think it's very reminiscent to me of the women at St. Elizabeth Monastery in Minsk, Belarus, because I have them over every year. I usually sponsor their letter. They have this kind of diaconal ministry, but they're not called deaconesses, and they don't seek this, right? They wear a little uniform, they serve people, they serve the homeless, the poor, and this diaconal ministry already exists, right? With the St. Elizabeth convent. So I thought it was all very, very interesting, but again, doesn't seem to indicate that there was this one-to-one role, male deacon versus female deacon, in any way, shape, or form.
Well, no, especially when you compare the historical reality with today's reality of what we see male deacons do, which has been relegated pretty much to a liturgical role, although I have learned of notable exceptions that some churches do have very active deacons in the community, which I applaud, of course.
Yeah, and I also wanted to say that because I had sent out several emails today, people asking about the role of the deacon, and I have to say, I was a little bit struck. Now, this might be a jurisdictional thing, but I would love to hear from people in the chat box about what do your deacons do? Are they purely liturgical functionaries? Not in my parish. In my parish, the deacons run the men's group, run the society that we have for the poor. You know, they do all kinds of things. They teach in the church school. They catechize. This is really very, very important. They are not simply, you know, junior priests, as I've heard it. That's not a diaconal ministry. So I think it's very wrong to say that, you know, deacons need to learn their function again. I can remember when I was growing up, there were no such thing as deacons. The only deacon you ever saw was the one with the bishop. And then the OCA started to restore the diaconate, and it is not just the liturgical function these days. Deacons are doing all kinds of very, very good and important work today.
Yeah, and the whole thing about the difference between what they did historically and what is being proposed. I did find it interesting that there does appear to be an attempt to downplay the liturgical currently with our friends at the St. Phoebe Center, and I think because they may be feeling the pushback of trying to envision an identical role, and I don't want to speak for them. I have no idea whether, they're making any adjustments or not, that if what you're calling for is a female deacon with the stole saying again and again, in peace let us pray to the Lord, that's beyond restoration. That's definitely innovation, as they would put it.
Right. And I just want to say one more quick thing, and this is to the folks in the chat room. Some people are asking, are your deacons paid? Well, no, because they have full-time jobs. But these guys are also working in our church probably 15, 20 hours a week sometime. So it's not necessarily about the pay. I would love to pay them. But, at this particular point, what they're doing is they are serving the church. They're not just swinging a censer. They are actually helping people. All right, John, what's next?
All right, so we do have many contacts and many very good friends who have come to Orthodoxy from either Episcopal or liberal Lutheran backgrounds, and they've seen this before. And the fear is it's a slippery slope. We are moving from first female deacons, then female priests, then female bishops. And so this next section is all about the female priesthood. And so prior to working on this project, we heard all kinds of concerns expressed, and I think we really wanted to dive deep into this to find out whether this was the agenda. And was it the agenda of some, and maybe not all? I don't know. But what I will say is that, any attempt at justifying female priests is going nowhere. It is, and it should be shut down immediately. So let's listen and let's find out about the theology of priesthood. Is there a theology of the male priesthood? And what about that slippery slope? Is this moving toward an inevitable conclusion? So this is part 4, the female priesthood. Part 4, the female priesthood. So what is at the heart of the concern about restoring female deacons? It's a concern which many converts to Orthodoxy, especially those coming from Episcopal or more liberal Lutheran backgrounds, have seen happen in their lifetimes. I'm not talking about female deacons, but female priests, a concern which begs 2 questions. 1, is there a reason why the Orthodox Church has never, in its over 2,000-year history, had female priests? And 2, is the proposed restoration of the female diaconate part of a larger scheme to eventually see that change? Let's start with this clip of an interview I did with Metropolitan Kallistos Ware of blessed memory in 2011, where I asked him if the Orthodox Church would ever consider ordaining female priests.
It's not very clear theologically why it is impossible for a woman to be a priest. So there is a small group of Orthodox who say, let us not assert that this question is entirely closed and that there is nothing to discuss. Because actually we Orthodox have not yet thought profoundly about this matter. The Orthodox literature on this subject is very superficial. Most people can't manage more than an article, let alone a book. And would it not be better, more humble for us Orthodox to say, this is basically, until now, a Western question. We have not made that question as yet our own. And so, rather than saying impossible, absurd, let us more humbly say we need to think and pray much more deeply about this. We have not yet gone to the heart of this problem.
Now, before we get too worked up about that comment from His Eminence, let's listen to what Father Stephen DeYoung has to say about it.
But it is true, as Metropolitan Council said, that this isn't something that a lot of ink has been spilled, at least not a lot of surviving ink, from the Church Fathers and from other ecclesiastical writers. Part of that, I would imagine, is because in general, the things that we find written about in great detail are things that were challenged, where someplace where the practice or teaching of the church was challenged, then you get a lot of writing defending and explaining the church's position. And there frankly weren't any cultural challenges to that for most of the history of the church, which shouldn't surprise anyone regardless of where they stand on the issue, right?
Yeah, sure.
There wasn't a push for women's ordination in the 13th century, right? That shouldn't be shocking to anyone.
Dr. Jeannie Constantinou agrees.
I am of the opinion that we cannot point to some reason that women cannot be priests from a theological perspective, because I know that Father Hopko and some other theologians said, well, because Christ was a man, the priest has to be a man and that sort of a thing. But that really is, from my understanding, a Catholic argument. It is not something, the priesthood isn't, I think, essentially male, because that view of priesthood is more along the lines of modeling oneself after in other words, the priest stands at the altar. This is the Catholic view, and he kind of recreates the sacrifice of the Mass by saying the words of institution. We don't have that understanding. So I don't think that we could point to a theological reason in that sense. However, there is a reason for not doing it, and I would think it would be considered theological, and that is the fact that orthodoxy, by definition, by the essence of who we are, is that we are the church that has preserved apostolic tradition that is essential to our identity, to our very nature. So to innovate in that way, to bring something new into the church, something so radically new, would be to change the essence of orthodoxy. And I don't see how that could ever be acceptable.
Dr. Frost did use the word innovation when talking about whether the church would ever ordain women as priests.
We have ample historical precedent for deaconesses, but none for female priests. So deaconesses would be a revival of a historical tradition, whereas priests would be a total innovation.
And while Professor Jim Skedros says the female priesthood is a non-starter, he also cautions about what he calls ossification.
You're absolutely right. And to me, that's a non-starter as well. And I think that any kind of a conversation like that, you're absolutely right. I mean, so it is kind of a slippery slope, but the other one is a slippery slope as well. So what becomes ossified, and who determines what becomes ossified? And is ossification really, Orthodox tradition, absolutely, but sometimes it can become ossified in a way in which it doesn't make a whole lot of sense anymore.
Yet the concern remains for Dr. Humphrey if proponents even open up the possibility of considering female priests.
Though there have been clear statements that we're only talking about the diaconate, we're not talking about priests and bishops. There have been both clear statements and subtle statements opening up the possibility of the discussion moving beyond the diaconate among those who are proponents of the female diaconate. For example, ordaining deaconesses will inevitably lead to a conversation about women in the priesthood. Or in another more subtle case and much more careful, another proponent said it would be foolhardy to rush out as a proponent for the ordination of women to the other two orders based on this view of theology. But then this person goes on to say, new theological investigations would necessarily explore the spiritual reality undergirding all three orders of ordained ministry. So it's being left open as to whether this is a first step.
Okay.
And so it's not a matter of slippery slope. It's looking at the arguments that they are giving when they insist that this is ordination, and given their understanding of the three orders being a unity, naturally the other questions are going to come forward. And once that happens, those of us who are concerned about the iconic representation of males and females, I think we have cause to be a little worried that richness will be lost and will simply be a flat church without a response and call between those who are leading in the liturgy and those who are responding.
Father Stephen DeYoung offers a model of the male priesthood, which he feels is rooted in both Scripture and history.
The truth is, as we discover biblically, and the development of the idea of priesthood, is that what we come to later call priesthood is essentially identical with the biblical vision of masculinity, of what it means to be male. What it means to be a man is to be a priest. We have to understand also that there are different priesthoods. So in the Old Testament, there is a priesthood that is restricted to Aaron's family, right? And particular members of Aaron's family, the high priesthood. There is a priesthood that is restricted to the tribe of the Levites. But there's also a priesthood that the nation of Israel as a whole had in relationship to the other nations of the world. So we need to be aware that, and this is carried through into the church, there is a priesthood that the church as a whole has in relationship to the world. But that is not exclusive to, and this is the difference between, for example, Luther's teaching of the priesthood of all believers, that is not exclusive of a sacramental priesthood, right? There are different levels and different areas of priesthood. And one that hasn't been brought out enough is biblically that fatherhood is a priesthood. Before there is any kind of separate, independent priesthood, as you read through Genesis, Book of Job, another example, the person who is offering sacrifices is the father of the family, the head of the household. He is going out, he is offering sacrifices and prayers for himself and for his family. And the core of priesthood here is that he is representing God to his family and his family before God. And so this is what it means to be a man and a father, is to exercise this capacity of representing God to the people over whom you have authority and representing those people over whom you have authority before God in prayer and intercession. This later on, due to some issues with Moses that I won't go into super detail on here, and then at the episode with the golden calf, the priesthood gets separated off into this sort of separate priesthood with the Levites and with Aaron, and so you don't see just the family of every household offering sacrifices. But there is still a priesthood there for the father of the family. So it's the father who leads the Passover celebration for the family. It's the father who kills the lamb. It's the father who answers the questions with the son and is responsible for passing this on. And so this is what it means to be a man. And making this point and exploring this is important for men, right? Because our society has a very deviant view of what it means to be a man. It means apparently now to eat raw meat and spend all your time in the gym admiring yourself.
Man cave.
Yeah. or it means to be kind of brutish and dumb, or it means to be violent, right? Et cetera, right? It means to be sexually promiscuous, whatever. That is not the biblical view of what masculinity is. The biblical view of what masculinity is to be a priest. And so the priesthood is a calling. And I'm using priesthood here broadly, right? When it comes to the priesthood within the church, to include bishops, priests, right, deacons. This is a calling that's placed on every generation of men within the church to become the next generation to take on that responsibility. And those who aren't ordained within the church still have that, are called to that kind of priesthood within their families, within their workplaces, within their, right, wherever they are, to exercise that kind of priesthood.
Don't go away. When we return, we will address the very important topic of need. The Church historically responds to need through our bishops, who see a need and try to respond to it. So, is there a need for female deacons today? Stay tuned.
All right, welcome back. So, I have to say, I am a little bit disappointed that there doesn't seem to be a well thought out theology about the male nature of the priesthood. It doesn't mean that it's not the tradition. It's very, very clear. Every one of them said that our tradition is that it is a male priesthood. Father Stephen, that I would say Dr. Humphrey said that it's iconic, right? Father Stephen said that priests were always male, and you have this kind of patriarchal role in the family, in the community, in the religion, and so forth. However, we really need to develop this idea, because I think the issue here, this is, I think people they're shocked that you took on this subject, right? Like, why are we even talking about women priests? Well, it's because not just that it's the tradition, but you have to be able to articulate why. And so a lot of work has to be done on this. Father Tom Hopko had edited a book, I think it was called Women in the Priesthood. It was like in the mid-1970s or 1980s or something. And even then, all of them were saying, well, it's this reason, it's that reason, but it's just such an important part of our tradition, our understanding of who we are as a church, but it doesn't seem to be articulated very well.
Yeah, and frankly, excuse me, I thought Dr. Constantino made the strongest argument because while she agreed that, no, we have not done a lot of theological research on this, she said there is a theological reason. It's because we've never done it. The Orthodox Church doesn't invent new practices. And for 2,000 plus years, it's been the male priesthood. If we change that now, then how could we say that we're not innovating? How can we say that we're not departing from the tradition that's been handed down to us? So, to me, this is a complete non-starter. There is no way I would even want to be a part of the Orthodox Church if we could depart from our great tradition that easily.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very important to emphasize that. On the other hand, I would like to see some theology behind it. I would like to see a real unpacking of this is, there is something essential here. And I think also it probably has to do and Father Stephen was starting to talk about this, right? The roles of men and women and how they are different in society. I think in our very flat, and I think Dr. Edith Humphrey talked about that, in our very flat culture where everybody has to be the same and everybody has to do the same thing, the idea that men and women are different and that men and women have different roles is not very popular. So we need to do a really good job of maintaining and asserting that priests are male, and here's why. And I think we have to go beyond simply that it's the tradition.
Well, and it is reflective of our culture, right? The reason why this hasn't had discussion that much in the past, as Father Stephen DeYoung said, never would have dreamed that we would have to have the discussion. But in our culture today, we obviously do.
Very good. All right, what's next?
All right, so very interesting, part 5, the need for deaconesses today. And this has come out a lot in the chat room. Why do we need it? What's the need? I don't get why we're even discussing this. And so you're going to hear people on both sides of this say, well, we need it for this reason, but you're going to also hear others say, we don't need it. It's not broken. Don't fix it. It was finished for a reason. It was stopped for a reason.
Right.
And so the need for deaconesses today, that's our part 5.
Here we go.
Part 5. The need for deaconesses today. In most of my interviews for this documentary, I asked the question about the need for deaconesses today. I have to say that it was an interesting experience. What I was trying to get at was this. What would an ordained deaconess be able to do that a laywoman could not? As you would expect, the answers sprung from the panelists' predisposition about the restoration of the office today. So, if one was a proponent, we would hear about the need for a woman-to-woman ministry of counseling or even confession, with absolution given afterwards by the male priest in areas concerning marital relations, motherhood, abortion, miscarriages, sexual abuse, caregiving, and other issues. We heard about the need for catechetical instruction of a woman for a woman, and we heard about the need for a female deacon to take the Eucharist to the elderly and infirm. From the opponents, we heard that everything that the proponents have identified as a need could be accomplished by qualified, educated, and seasoned women already, with the exception of bringing the Eucharist to people who cannot come to church. But let's let the panelists speak for themselves. We'll begin with Mother Christophora, the abbess of the Monastery of the Holy Transfiguration in Elwood City, Pennsylvania.
The case that an abbess could commune a sister if she was sick or dying from the reserved sacrament, I believe that existed, so that was that kind of a blessing to do that. I know that because of that history, a monastery that I know that is in a non-Orthodox country and rather very, very far removed from other Orthodox churches or bishops or so on. They have their bishop, but they don't have a full-time priest in that women's monastery. And recently, their bishop did bless the abbess to commune the sisters on great feast days, I believe, because they receive communion so infrequently. And that, to me, seems to be a practical application. Seems that the church, if the church finds the need, it also finds a solution. So in some ways, the question right now of deaconesses, I would think we would have to say, what is the need? Where is the need? And what is the solution?
This is consistent with something our beloved Father Thomas Hopko of blessed memory said in one of his podcasts on Ancient Faith Radio.
It isn't an issue of which tradition is worth keeping. It's an issue, rather, of what is needed in the church. I can't decide that. I can't decide it for myself. I would say, as long as our leaders, our bishops, don't think that we need this ministry in the church today, since it went out of practice at some point in history with very few exceptions, but still there were exceptions in practically the entire Orthodox Church history of this. But in any case, I don't think we should say you've got a tradition and the issue is whether you should keep it or not keep it. The issue is whether you need it or not.
Here's Dr. Jim Skedros from Holy Cross Hellenic College.
I do think that there's something to be said about the female-to-female pastoral ministry that a female diaconate would bring. I wonder, especially now in the context in which we live, whether there's something valuable about that. Not to say that men can't minister to women and women can't minister to men, but I think there's something there. I mean, you know, at my parish, local parish, there's a all-women's group that gets together for spiritual direction and guidance, and they've been doing this for decades at my parish, and nobody's mad at them or anything. I know lots of parishes have morning male-only Bible studies. So I think there's something about female-to-female, male-to-male kind of pastoral ministry, and the female diaconate could possibly participate or contribute to that.
The issue of women-to-women ministries came up a lot in my discussions with our panelists, and I am certainly not qualified to assess the legitimacy of that need. It is something, however, that Dr. Jeannie Constantinou felt pretty strongly about.
What I have read people say, well, women need women's gifts. I don't buy that. I don't agree with that, because there's nothing special about what a woman can offer. There's no grace that's only for a woman or from a woman or by a woman. Now, as a wife of a priest, I understand that sometimes women want to talk to other women, but you don't need an ordained position to do that. We have a lot of women who are either theologians or they are counselors or psychologists. They can fulfill that role without having it be an ordained role. And if they want a blessing from the bishop, your grace, I really feel called to go to prisons and minister to women or to counsel women. Would you please pray over me? He will do that. Your parish priest will do that. That's different from ordination.
I had this conversation with Dr. Valerie Karras, a proponent of restoring deaconesses today, who was patient with me as I tried to learn more about the need that would extend beyond taking the Eucharist to the shut-in. And what need would be met that cannot be met apart from a full ordination of a female deacon today? And maybe you could help us even itemize some of those things.
I think one of the very important ones is counseling, is pastoral ministry, especially pastoral ministry that combines the pastoral counseling function with liturgical functions, such as giving the Eucharist. So we have women serving as chaplains in a number of hospitals and hospices these days, but they cannot take the Eucharist to Orthodox who would like to take communion.
Dr. Sarah Byrne Martelli is an Orthodox lay chaplain serving both Christian and non-Christian individuals. She has successfully served in this role since 2002 and has the full endorsement of the Orthodox Church.
During my clinical pastoral education, I was already Orthodox, and I was, spoke to my priest and got to know different priests and bishops. And so then thankfully, I was at a OCA church at the time, and I met with the Metropolitan at the time, and he just said kind of, what do you need? And I said, well, this endorsement to be a chaplain and to provide care for the sick and dying. And he said, okay. And then so I got a letter, and that is my endorsement that I've now had. Now I'm in the Antiochian Archdiocese. I moved and got married and various things. So, yeah.
So you have a letter that states that you are officially connected to the Orthodox Church and serve with her blessing. Would that be a good way to describe what you have?
Indeed, yes. I mean, the concept of having a blessing to do something is not very unfamiliar to us, right? And so, it's just like an official blessing says I'm in good standing with my parish, I'm actively involved in the parish, and I have the training. And it's been great because I've really been able to get to know, priests in the area and get to know my bishop and really remain in close communication with him about my work and what I'm doing.
She told us a beautiful story of an emergency baptism she did as a lay minister with the blessing of her bishop and priest.
One time there was a baby of an Orthodox couple who was sadly dying, who was a preemie, and they wanted someone to baptize the baby. And the NICU chaplain is a lay Catholic woman, and she offered to them, we had a Catholic priest on staff, like who could be there right in 10 minutes, or me. And they actually chose me because I think they wanted someone who is from their tradition. And so I actually called, I talked to Father Anthony, I talked to Bishop John, and I had oil that we can, we bless people with. So, and so actually I did a baptism sort of as faithfully as I could, faithfully using the prayers of the church. Now, it wasn't, an official church baptism, but that was an instance where I was connected to my clergy who could kind of talk me through it. And I do think that, certainly in a time of where someone is about to pass away, we can kind of step up and do this, as authentically and prayerfully as possible. And I don't think anyone would have a problem with that.
St. Phoebe Center board member Dr. Helen Theodoropoulos made her case for the need today.
The church needs both and, not either or. We both need the ministry both of actively engaged lay people and the ordained ministries recognized by our church and as part of our tradition. We should never think of their work as hindered or imperfect without diaconal ordination. What each offers, deaconess and laywoman, is important, but different. Ordination to the diaconate is transformative, changing the deaconess and her relationship to the community of faithful. She is now accountable to the community, and in turn, she's vested with the gift of representing the church. Her commitment is permanent for the remainder of her life, and her diaconate now governs her behavior and guides her work. Furthermore, this diaconal ordination connects her work in the world, whether it's counseling or education or therapy or visitation, to the liturgical life with what we are doing in church. So in this way, her work becomes the work of the church.
So I asked Father Stephen DeYoung to objectively make a case for the need of a restored female diaconate today, even though he would be opposed to the enhanced role being proposed.
The argument I'd give in terms of why we should, if that's what I was called upon to do, would be, first of all, I think in our, and here in the context of the United States, in our post-Me Too era, and from my own pastoral experience and from the pastoral experience of priests I know, there is a need to have designated women who are able to visit with and be with the other women of the church in situations where it's not appropriate for a man to be there, or at least where male clergy being there is going to subject him potentially to ministry-ending accusations and potential issues. We as priests have all received dozens of talks and letters and guidelines from bishops. We all have windows in our offices now. We all, if a woman wants to come and give confession, I have to have somebody else in the church building.
Yeah.
On and on and on because of this. And one thing that would help with that is if we had, again, designated women who we know are solid, right, and advanced in the faith and sound in the faith, who could assist in those regards, which was one of the primary responsibilities originally for having deaconesses. A lot of our women's groups in churches are groups of people who the parish council can ask to make food for potlucks and these kind of things. Whereas if our churches have men's groups, I think a lot of them are focused on like reading books together and the priests giving talks to them about the faith. And I think our women's groups need more of the other. And I think part of being able to do that from women's perspective is, again, having designated women who are good teachers who can teach the other women. St. Paul says older women need to teach younger women in the faith. So I think there's a need there that could be fulfilled. I think, frankly, that limited liturgical role I described, even there's a positive element to that. As much as it would set some people's teeth on edge about slippery slopes and all this, I think even that would play a helpful purpose in getting some of this reactionary position out of our mind. That no, it's not that women are unclean and can't ever go behind the iconostasis. It's that they have this other role. And reinforcing to women and young women who might be pulled toward unhealthy forms of what gets called feminism, a better understanding of, you know, a lot of times we pay lip service to the fact that, well, there are other roles for women in the church, but we don't have those clearly defined. So an actual woman in our parish looks at us and says, like what?
Yeah.
You know, and trust me, the answer, making casseroles for the potlucks is not going to,
Not going to cut it.
not going to carry water.
Yeah.
Right. And so having those things, no, look, there is, right? So there are different roles that are fulfilled by them. They're both valuable, but they're different. And having that be actually there institutionally and visibly for people to see.
Yeah.
So those to me would be the positives. That's not to say that that's the whole case. There are all kinds of other things that bishops would want to and need to consider. But if I was charged with give me the positive case, right, of what needs that could fulfill, that would be roughly my answer.
At the core of our exploration in this documentary is service. Whether you are for or against the restoration of the female diaconate, we can all agree that there are plenty of needs out there that should be addressed. Those needs are often met by clergy, but the ratio of clergy to laity is low. Our bishops, priests, and deacons can't do it all. Father Lucas Christensen would like to remind us that we are all ordained for service at our baptism.
Anyone who's hearing this, who is a Christian person, even if you never go and, under the solea or the front of your church and have whoever's in authority read a prayer over you, you already did. When you were baptized, you were brought into the waters and you were brought out. You were reborn in Christ. You were born from above. You were set apart. You were ordained to liturgical, ministry, and to the ministry to the people of God and to everyone around you. You're already ordained. So even if you don't have a special label, even if you don't have that going on, serve other people.
It seems to come down to how much importance one gives to an actual ordained role. For some, there is an element of clericalism involved, and Father Joseph Lucas cautions that we should not connect too closely the ministerial role we are all called to a clerical ordination.
The idea that there has to be a rank and order for them to do this, I don't think that is clericalism. Because the idea that if you don't have an ordained position with a title to go along with it, that your ministry somehow is not effective or real, that is actually clericalism. That's the idea that, and when all this pushback, about clericalism has happened in the last decades, you would think that we would want to empower the laity to do more, which is what most priests are doing, I think, today. Most priests I know are training and empowering their laity to go and do more charity, to do more, ministry to people in need in their parish, those who need that assistance. And, I don't know how often I've various ladies in my parish, when we've gone to the hospital, I've had little crews of women go with me and help out and be present, sometimes sing the service with me when I do the service for distributing the Eucharist to the sick. And so they don't need a special title to do that, per se. I think that it definitely smacks of clericalism to think that we have to have a title and just to wrench something from antiquity that had a very unique place, a very unique function for that time, and then to try to reinvent it for now so that someone can have a title, I think is problematic.
As we wrap up this section about the perceived need for deaconesses, His Eminence Metropolitan Saba shared a story of his visit to Greece several years ago, where a specific need was addressed by non-monastic nuns. It made him wonder if what they should be called in that circumstance would be deaconesses.
I was in Greece in 2007, and I visited huge center for Lydia Fellowship. Lydia Fellowship, it is from the Lydia, the name of this woman who received St. Paul in Philippi city, and she was the first European to accept a Christian faith from St. Paul. There are about 150 women. This huge center, 9 floors. They have publishing house. It was at that time the most technical in Greece. They do many ministries. Some of them work in their cities as teachers, as doctors, in the media. They have television TV, religious television TV. They received at that time 300 children from Kosovo and Bosnia. They come to help them psychologically in their center. I want to say that they have a huge ministry. They wear what we call it a suit of long skirt and jacket. They put nothing on their head. but they have different style, unified style for their hair. Very simple. I met them, and they received me very well. I met their spiritual father, who was very pure man. He was old man. Where we were talking, he told me that there is a debate between them and the Gregorio monastery in the Holy Mountain. They call themselves nuns. The Gregorio monastery doesn't accept that they are nuns because their life is not traditional according to the monastic life in the Orthodox Church. They go out of their monastery and they do ministry and minister in different fields. So during our discussion, I told him, why you don't call them yourselves a deaconess? You work like deacon in different ministries, but not in liturgical field.
Yes.
So why you insist upon naming yourselves nuns? The monastic life, according to the Orthodox tradition, especially after St. Basil the Great, has a sekia, a prayer life. You don't live in such a way. So why you insist to be named nuns? Call deaconess. He couldn't understand me. So I tried to give him some example. I told him, you work like the Latin orders. Of course, he was so upset, he couldn't. He supposed that I accused him. I told him, little bit, Father, do you know what Latin nuns work? He told me, no, I didn't meet one time Latin nuns. So I explained to him, even in the Catholic Church, some orders now call themselves mercenaries, not nuns, because they started to see that they don't live according to the traditional monastic life. So that means why I am saying this example. I believe that there is a debate in the Orthodox Church to find a ministry to the women, but they don't know what is the position of women until now. So I believe we should think, we should pray, we should discuss to find the best position, but not because we are influenced by humanistic movements. Whatever these movements are good. Our motive could be what the church needs and how we can be loyal to our faith and to our church.
Okay, great, John. So this section was about whether this role is needed. And it seems, that the most compelling arguments that I heard were, for instance, to say, to work in the church, you don't need a title. You don't need a role. There may be some issue with encouraging ministries in the church. And this is one thing that I wanted to say. And again, I'm not saying that my parish is a great example of, the best parish ever. However, I even have to take issue with Father Stephen a little bit because, he really minimized the idea of saying, well, if we're just going to ask women to cook for the potluck and so forth. And I'm sure he was using that as an extreme example, right? No priest should be doing that. If a priest is relegating women to simply do those things, then he's not encouraging ministries within the church. I mean, St. Paul is very clear about this. Everybody has gifts, right? Now, in my parish, I have a woman that is the parish council president. I have one woman that is a choir director. I have, women that are running all kinds of ministries, including the women's ministry. I have a world-renowned theologian in my parish that is a woman. So, the question is, do they need to be ordained, or do they need a special title to do that? And I still don't see the need, because here's the thing. If you look at and nobody ever said this in any of the clips that we've heard, but the main reason why this happened in the early church was the segregation of sexes. Right? There was a way in which men were in one place, women were in another place, and the Christians did not want to, they wanted to keep propriety away from the pagans, the way the pagans did things. So they were very careful about women should be with women, men should be with men. That kind of doesn't exist anymore. I understand Father Stephen's desire to say, well, it's the Me Too movement, and we don't want to do anything that's untoward or gets a priest in trouble. But I think those things can be easily done. You just don't have to have a woman deacon do it just to kind of keep the priest out of trouble.
Yeah, and I think the onus on the proponents for the restoration is to show how, beyond giving the Eucharist to the infirm or taking the Eucharist to women in their homes, beyond that, what need cannot be met by a layperson. And I know they feel very strongly that, well, no, it's all the same, that it's both and I get that they believe that passionately. I'm just, from my standpoint, it was hard for me to see beyond that one issue that there was actually a need today. And here's where we say, it's not going to be our decision. It's going to be our bishops who will make whatever decision they make based on their perceived need of what is lacking. And if there is something lacking, I'm sure the bishops will want to try to meet that, but maybe they don't see that something is lacking.
Yeah, I am going to read one comment here that came in the chat box, and it says, it was by Orthodox Boomer Grandma. She says, we do not want to discourage men by letting women become too dominant in the church. I agree with her from that standpoint. If you go and watch like an Episcopal service that has a woman minister or whatever, there's almost no men there, right? We have to be very careful about this. We have to be very careful not to send the wrong message. And so I appreciate that particular comment, because it is something that we have to think about. It doesn't mean that women shouldn't be treated with tremendous respect and they shouldn't be given leadership roles. The issue is it necessary for them to be ordained to do that?
So, part 6.
Yeah, no. So I have to say one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So we're going to open up the phone lines now. We're only taking, I know this is crazy, we're only taking 4 calls. So good luck. 1-855-237-2346. 1-855-237-2346. Now what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the very last portion of this documentary, and then we're going to open up the phone lines.
Part 6, Unity and Conclusion. In this final section, I want to begin with an important reflection on our unity as Orthodox Christians. Should we be concerned that we are not unified on this subject of deaconesses? The reason we are having this discussion is to better understand the pros and cons of restoring female deacons today. The discussion itself should not affect unity if we approach it in good faith, with humility and respect. In her keynote address at the recent St. Phoebe Center Conference, Dr. Frost said this about unity.
Sometimes we at the St. Phoebe Center hear the conjecture that ordaining deaconesses might cause division. My first response to this concern about division is that fear of division should not be our yardstick for considering change in the church. Our yardstick for changing or not changing should be the truth of our tradition, which honors the shared dignity of women and men and has as part of its history an ordained order of deaconesses. The Church's concern should not be with theoretical division, it should be with our fidelity to the liberating gospel message of Jesus Christ.
For Dr. Constantinou, this is a matter of great importance, causing her to be very apprehensive about the possibility of one bishop or one jurisdiction ordaining deaconesses in isolation.
If any bishop was foolish enough to go forward and actually ordain a female deacon, this would cause a great schism in the church, and it's not worth it. I mean, we still have people on different calendars. We're going to introduce, this is deeply theologically disturbing because it reflects an attitude of individuality, of individualism. I think this is the right thing to do, therefore I'm going to do it. And that's not how we operate in the Orthodox Church. So if we begin ordaining women deacons just because a few people think it's a good idea, where's the call? Where's the need in the church? Where are the women who are clamoring? And even if they did, they're misunderstanding what orthodoxy is about. It's about preserving the ancient apostolic tradition, not responding to the whims of change in the world, because we can always come up with some rational reason why something needs to be changed in the church. And if we follow that thinking rather than preserving what the church has given us, which has been the source of our sanctification, we're not sanctified because we follow our own opinions and try to follow our own, objectives and our own self-will. We're sanctified through the church because the church is the vehicle for salvation because it hasn't changed.
Dr. Helen Theodoropoulos was asked about the concern of schism over the ordaining of deaconesses. So are you concerned about division in the Pan-Orthodox Church if the restoration of deaconesses only happens in one jurisdiction in the U.S.?
I think division always is a concern. Christ calls his body to unity, and so we should always be grieved should we see division among the faithful, and we should always work to overcome it. The church has weathered multiple storms of disagreement. Our history is filled with examples, right? But we weather it precisely because we are compelled as brothers and sisters in Christ to work together, live together, and to love one another. So I don't want our thoughts to spiral to the darkest places and think that we are splintering over everything, but rather trust in the bond that we have.
And in my interview with Dr. Karras, she claims that there is a silent schism of women leaving the church, although she cited no statistics to bear that out.
One of the things that I think that people ignore, because those who oppose, are so vocal, is the silent schism that is underway even as we speak. We need to be sensitive to those who are silently leaving. You had mentioned earlier about the question of schism, and I really think we don't pay enough attention to the quiet disapproval or the quiet even shattering of self-identity of some women and girls in our communities.
In subsequent follow-up with Dr. Carrie Frost at the St. Phoebe Center, she told us that this has actually not been researched because it's not possible to survey this population well. She and the center are basing this on anecdotal emails and conversations. And Dr. Constantinou counters that if deaconesses were restored today, there would be a different kind of exodus.
If we change the church to pacify people, to show girls that there's nothing wrong with orthodoxy, we're going to lose a whole lot more people who have come to the Orthodox Church or who are Orthodox, people like me, because we believe that the church has preserved apostolic tradition. So what we should be doing is modeling for our girls leadership in the church, There's a lot of things we can do, and encouraging them to make use of their gifts in the church.
I asked Metropolitan Saba about a scenario that would have one jurisdiction in the Assembly of Bishops ordaining a female deacon on its own. While he was not aware that this was being considered, and neither are we for that matter, he did want to emphasize the importance of unity in major decisions in order to maintain the witness of the Church in this country.
But I think whatever any jurisdiction does alone have negative influence upon the other jurisdictions and the unity of Orthodox churches and jurisdiction about the unity of Orthodoxy in America. We should be aware of this. Our unity means our witness to our true faith. When our unity is broken, that means our witness is broken also. This is more important than anything else, according to my mind.
So, what is our takeaway on the consideration of unity over a return to the female diaconate? We are hearing on the one hand that fear of division should not stop us from moving forward, and on the other hand, the restoration of deaconesses today would represent a dramatic change if that restoration is actually more than a restoration when compared to what the deaconesses were historically. In light of that, we should be concerned about unity, and whatever we do, we should do together. We've come to the end of our examination of the call to restore the female diaconate today. So how do we wrap up this overall conversation? I would propose several things. First, history is messy. Some things are indisputable, like the existence of ordained female deacons in both the early and mid-centuries of the Church. Other things are fuzzy, like the nature of ordinations or the variety of functions they performed in any given region, or the reasons why the female diaconate died out, with some rare exceptions. Can we draw any conclusions from that? Probably not, but we can say it apparently never got real traction in the broadly based church around the globe. Second, changes don't come easily in the Orthodox Church, for good reason. Obviously, any change that contradicts the historic creeds and councils of the Church are off the table. But over the centuries, various needs arose that necessitated action of some kind on the part of the bishops. Some of those actions ended up being universal, like the giving of the Eucharist to the faithful on a spoon, or the use of vestments in their various forms and for various clerical functions. Others were localized, and when there was a deaconess appointed, it was always because it was needs-based, as opposed to any sense of gender inclusivity, so that both male and female clergy were represented. And this will be no different. If there is to be a reviving of the female diaconate, it will be because it has become obvious to the bishops that something is lacking in serving the needs of the faithful. Third, if we can agree on nothing else, may this exercise result in a renewed celebration, no matter what your position is, of the thousands of strong, holy, faithful female saints, martyrs, confessors, theologians, teachers, monastics, and yes, deaconesses throughout the history of the Orthodox Church. We start, of course, with the Theotokos herself, and then trace the venerable lineage of female heroes of the faith from the time of the apostles themselves. Mother Christophora just names a few.
Celebrating the daily saints in a monastery kind of broadens our horizon as to the women that served our Lord and have been formally canonized by the Church. Many of them, of course, were martyrs in the early Church. That's a pretty common celebration. And just interesting, often in the verses to the female martyrs, there'll be a line that says something like, "You were very manly." meaning that you had courage. I think you had courage. This woman had courage, strength, and stick-to-itiveness to stand her ground. Someone like Martyr Catherine was very intelligent, very bright, and put the orators to shame. The church recognizes her and others like her. Someone like Saint Elizabeth, who was a royalty, but she founded a convent that would serve the poor and the needy. And still going on, of course, in Belarus is the very well-known St. Elizabeth Convent that has lay sisters. So that's an interesting role. I don't know much about how they define that, but they call them sisters, but they call them lay sisters. So they're not monastics. Some of those are actually married. And of course, the Sisters of Lazarus, Martha and Mary, among the saints, friends of Christ, offered him hospitality. So we see that the church is saying, women have a gift and they have strength. And then there's Venerable Paula, who was an abbess, and she was a disciple to Saint Jerome, but she was also an advisor to Saint Jerome because he had rough edges, so she would tone him down sometimes. Venerable Macrina, an abbess whose brothers are well known in the church, Basil and Peter, and she toned them down. Gregory, also St. Gregory, she had to tone them down and teach them some things. Imagining as women how much effect we have on others, we can't neglect that. So whether we're actually going to have a ordained deaconess or blessed deaconess, we already have so much spiritual authority, let's say, spiritual possibility. And then finally, Blessed Olga, who's made herself known after her death of bringing healing to women who've been abused. And we don't know a lot about her life because she lived very quietly. She worked very hard as a midwife, as a mother, charitable worker in her village. But it's the Native Alaskans are rather silent people. So she wasn't writing or corresponding or making phone calls or probably not even visiting, except maybe for the birth of a child as a midwife. But we find that she had a lot of spiritual authority, and God was working through her and continues to work through her. So I would just encourage women to keep doing what you're doing. Grow closer to God and give yourself to God wherever you are. It doesn't have to be given yourself to God in a monastery. Wherever you are, wherever you find yourself, grow closer to Him, and He's going to use you because He's not going to waste the grace He's giving you. He will bring others to Him through you.
Dr. Mary Ford, recently retired after 33 years as Associate Professor of New Testament at St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary, wrote an article in the Rule of Faith Journal entitled Continuing the Pattern, Orthodox Church Architecture in Light of the Old Covenant Temples and its Implications for a Controversial Contemporary Issue. This section was particularly relevant to our topic.
It seems hard to understand how those who are calling for women to be ordained as deacons and priests, including those who believe that their daughters and granddaughters will never feel at home in the Orthodox Church unless they see women serving in the altar, can imagine that girls and women are not being honored or valued when our church in every liturgy entrusts all the lay people, men, women, boys, and girls, to pray and to prepare for receiving Christ's body and blood and to strive to become saints. How is this not enough when every girl and every woman can achieve the highest possible goal for any human being, deification, becoming a saint, or even becoming equal to the apostles like St. Mary Magdalene? Not to mention the fact that the prime example of that highest achievement for any human being, whether male or female, is a woman, our All-Holy Lady Theotokos. In this very confused and troubled time in which we find ourselves, we especially need to have the male sacramental priesthood. We need to relearn about complementarity, about how we as men and women need to be united while fully appreciating our real differences and rejoicing in them with thanksgiving to our all-gracious Lord who made us this way. We need to better understand the crucial role of the laity and of prayer, the true means of making spiritual progress, of attaining holiness. We need to overcome clericalism, believing that only the clergy are doing what's really important, and to overcome a feminist tendency only to value what men usually do or customarily have done. In our Orthodox history, we have vastly more women saints than saints who were priests.
The church established by Christ needs everyone, male and female, and Metropolitan Saba sees it as a family of faithful people using their talents to advance the cause of Christ.
There is talent or gifts for each sex of the people. There is something for the male and something for the female. So we understand it from this viewpoint. Priesthood was given by Christ to his disciples, not to the women who were with Christ and accompany Christ during his visits and journeys around Palestine when he was on our earth. He gave them, for example, the ministry of preaching when he told the women before he told the disciples that he was resurrected from the dead. He is alive. So those talents, we need to know our talents in the church. For everyone, men or women. I look at this question from this viewpoint.
Yes, there are many talents that have been given to men and women throughout the centuries. But how many female Orthodox saints are there? Literally thousands, if you include the large number of martyred women like the 40 women martyrs at Heraclea in Thrace, commemorated on September 1st. Look it up. The St. Mary and Martha Orthodox Monastery in South Carolina has an extensive list on their website. The Orthodox Church has been guided and protected by the Holy Spirit since it was established by Christ and the apostles. It has miraculously preserved intact the great tradition, despite centuries of oppression, occupation, the occasional scandalous emperors and unscrupulous patriarchs. But it has also produced holy saints who modeled holiness and grace through humility, perseverance, and self-sacrifice. Let us learn from our past by following the examples of both the fathers and mothers of the Church in humility and thankfulness to the glory of God. Thanks for listening.
Okay. All right, John. First of all, thank you for all the work you did on that. I know that there was a lot going on there, and piecing all of that together, I'm sure, was very, very difficult at times, trying to get everything scheduled, put it together in a coherent format. And so what's going to happen with all of the interviews that you did?
Well, I know some people really enjoyed a specific speaker, and so there is going to be, even yet tonight, on the Ancient Faith Today podcast page, a podcast featuring all 16. Now, that's about 10 plus hours of audio, but we've provided a helpful time stamp guide. So, for example, if you want to hear Metropolitan Saba, the entire interview, we'll tell you exactly where in that file you can find him, or if you want to hear Dr. Frost, or if you want to hear Dr. Constantinu, or Father DeYoung, whoever you would like to hear more from, the entire interview is available that way. So that will be available even yet tonight.
All right, very good. Okay, very, very good. Let's go ahead and now go to the phone lines. And we're going to take our first call. I don't know who it is. Caller, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. You're on the call with me and John Maddex.
Hi, my name is Varvara. I'm a daughter of an Orthodox priest, and I minister to girls and women in the church, specifically those who have been abused. And so my question to me, and I'm kind of going to be direct here, but at this point in my spiritual formation, I feel called by the Holy Spirit, by God, to the ministry of a female deacon. And I guess my question is, what do women like me do when they feel called by God, but then they're discouraged by their church?
Tell me how you pronounce your name. Is it Varvara?
Yes.
All right, Varvara. Thank you for calling. I appreciate it. So here's what I would say as a priest and as someone that, deals with people that have different needs and different perspectives and so forth. The reality of the situation right now is that you should not be discouraged, right? You should not be discouraged simply because you feel that you have a calling that is a very specific calling, right? The calling that you are called to in Christ, first of all, is to become holy, is to grow closer to Christ, is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. And whatever that ministry that you have is, God will reveal that to you, right? St. Paul says in so many places about the various gifts that are in the church. The reality of the situation right now is that this role that you seek does not exist. What I would also say to you is I would be very careful to speak with a priest, to speak with someone to help you understand why you seem why this is so important to you that it only has to be this role. So I know that we don't have much time because we're low on time, but I do want to ask you, why do you feel that this is the calling and this is the only calling that you want?
Yes, well, this is, I mean, it's kind of very deep for me, so I think it would be hard for me to speak about it very briefly here. But I do feel at this point, and as I said, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I grew up Orthodox. I've lived near a monastery for a lot of my life. My spiritual father is a bishop, so it's not something that, I'm not influenced necessarily by what some people are purporting, which is feminism or whatnot. But I have been serving women, and I find that because women are often not necessarily recognized, but they don't have the gift of the Holy Spirit through the ordination, oftentimes we miss a lot of women who either leave the church or who do not have communion brought to them, but who need a woman, maybe they feel traumatized, because they had a bad experience with a priest or a man or whatever it may be. And so I just find that to me, it's very tragic when I'm seeing, at least on the ground, when I'm serving these women.
Yeah, I would be careful not to place too much emphasis on this particular role, but grow in your own holiness, find out how you can serve the church, and not simply sort of focus on, I have to be X. Because even, young men that want to go into the priesthood or older men that want to go into the priesthood, sometimes even if they have that desire, it doesn't mean that necessarily they should be a priest. This happens many times. Even men go to seminary and, they go to seminary and they go through their 3 years and the bishops say, no, this is not for you. So this actually does happen. John, anything you want to say?
No, I really would defer to you. I'm not a priest. I'm not a counselor. I am happy that you are in a spiritual relationship with a bishop, and so certainly you can be guided by your bishop, as we all should be. And I think this is really what it comes down to. What will our bishops say about this, and how will they
God bless you, Varvara.
want to proceed or not proceed?
All right, God bless you. Next call, we have Hunter. Hunter, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Hi there. Can you hear me, Father?
We can, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I am calling to ask about, just personally, I'm somebody that very much is in favor of the female diaconate. It's something that a lot of young people I'm friends with, particularly young women and even young men within my parish, are really big supporters of. I guess our question would be, how do we advocate for this to see it as something within our archdiocese, within Orthodoxy as a whole, or even should we be advocating for these sorts of things? I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, again, as a parish priest, I would sit down with somebody that wants to advocate for that, and I would have this long discussion, right? And I would say, why is this important? And I think that what we tried to do tonight was we tried to give a fair representation of those who are advocating for this. I do think that you need to ask yourself, are you asking for this simply out of political motives? Are you asking for this out of theological motives? That's very, very important. And so I would be careful. And personally, and please don't take this the wrong way, I can't necessarily say, yes, I think that you should advocate for this. I mean, I personally don't feel comfortable saying that, but I do think you should talk to your priest about it and just, simply have that discussion and try to come to some kind of understanding about it. John?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we are years and years and years away from this getting serious consideration given everything else that's going on. That's why you don't see a lot of bubbling down from the bishops about this. It's why I could not get many bishops to agree to come on. Because I'm sure they are also trying to figure out, well, how do we answer this? Is this a need? And I will always defer to our bishops. And I feel very strongly that, and I said this in the documentary, whatever we do, we must do together. So if the Assembly of Bishops together somehow feel that this is a need and this is the way to meet it, it will happen. But I don't see that agreement coming anytime soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Hunter. William, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. You're on the line with John Maddex and me.
Thank you very much. So I have heard from both Dr. Edith Humphrey and Machka Frederica Matthews Green the question on female ordination is one which we already know the answer to, but the reason for that is one which we moderns need more fully articulated. However, as Father Alexander Schneemann noted in his letter concerning women's ordination, these conversations and pushes are very heavily influenced by the decidedly non-Orthodox zeitgeist which is about us. So how do we modern Westerners approach these matters, such as what Father Stephen talked about, without us being distracted by and sucked in and influenced by the zeitgeist?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good question. And I think part of it, this is very important. In the way in which we understand the role of men and the role of women, this has to be even more articulated, this has to be more accurately articulated in our churches by our priests. We need young men to understand what it is to be a man. And Father Stephen said, and I think very clearly, he said, we don't want to caricature what a man is or what a male is. So the question is, what is the role of a man? What is the role of a woman? And I think, for decades and generations and thousands of years, it was just obvious. But now the zeitgeist, as you said, has confused all of that. And until we understand this is what a man is, this is what a woman is, which should be pretty obvious, but we have to articulate it to a generation that may be confused. I think that's going to be very, very important. John?
Well, I just have to look at the culture that we are in, and I would reflect on what Metropolitan Saba, I thought, articulated quite pastorally, and that is asking the question, why? What is the motive? Is the motive because there is a real need, or are we trying to even out the culture? Are we trying to make things even from a gender standpoint? And it would be unfair to say that everybody who is proposing a restoration would feel that their motivation is based on anything but a pure motive. We don't know. I don't know these people well enough to understand what might be motivating them, and I always hate to broad brush people and assume the worst about people. So I would just listen carefully to what Metropolitan Saba had to say about this and ask the question purely, why?
Yeah, thank you very, very much, William. I appreciate it. And, one thing I wanted to say about that, and I think we're going to take one recorded speak pipe that came in. Here's what I'm getting out of this program tonight. I think we priests and bishops have a lot of work to do. We have to make sure that our flock and our Orthodox Christians understand exactly what we believe and teach as Orthodox Christians, both from a doctrinal standpoint, but now from a anthropological standpoint, like these questions of what is a man, what is a woman. It's ridiculous to think about it. I was just hearing a statistic that said, the average age of some of these people that are getting married in certain states is 30. We need to do a better job as Orthodox Christians of reasserting the Orthodox doctrine about everything, and that's kind of what I'm getting out of this tonight. All right, I want to listen to one speak pipe. Can we play that, Trudy, please, Matushka?
So much has been discussed recently regarding kind of the restoration of the role of the deaconess in the Orthodox Church. Excuse me. I think it's important to define terminology. So using the word restoration implies that what's being restored is being brought back either exactly or very similarly to what it once was. However, in this example, it would mean the role of the deaconess would closely mirror the role as it existed in the Byzantine Church. However, if a modern restoration involves changing or expanding the role, as the current proponents of restoring, quote unquote, restoring the deaconess are doing, it follows that it would be innovative rather than restorative. So this proves to be a really important difference, because innovation in the guise of tradition is dishonest. It's inherently problematic. So how do we wrestle with that?
Yeah, and I think we covered that, right? So we covered that in the documentary to say that certainly in that particular section, there was a whole section that said, is this restoration or innovation, right? And what it seems to be, and especially if you look at the ask at the St. Phoebe Center, and I'm not necessarily calling them out, I'm just saying this is the reality. What they're asking for is much more than what the history seems to support. And so, they're leaning in this area of innovation, and I know they have a very particular way of presenting innovation. They say, well, there were monks and there were spoons, right? We use spoons in the liturgy, and so forth and so on. But I think this particular ask that they are looking for might just be a little bit too much. All right. I think we have another caller on the line. Father John Whiteford. Oh, we don't? Oh. we're ready for him. Come on, Father John, real quick. But I think I tried to call him out. He can call me later. All right. So anyway, John, any last words before we wrap it up tonight?
Well, in one of the comments before the show tonight, this goes back a couple of days, I read a comment from a respected Orthodox priest who was commenting in the midst of the social media tug of war. And I thought what he said was helpful. He said, while I'm not necessarily in favor of reviving the deaconess in America and in this moment, proponents of the deaconess revival, which I think is a genuinely interesting discussion, must realize forums that are truly inclusive with serious voices against are essential if deaconesses are to ever be ordained. And I think that kind of describes what we're trying to do with this documentary. Listen and have respected people who are calm and rational speak their mind why they're concerned. And this whole issue of innovation or restoration was certainly one of them. The other was need. It's why we wanted Metropolitan Saba to speak to this, and I would really encourage you to listen to that entire interview. I thought he very pastorally put this whole thing in perspective in terms of timing, in terms of motive, in terms of unity, and in terms of assessing what needs there are. And so the bow I would put on this again is there something lacking in our church today? The proponents would say absolutely. We are lacking deaconesses. We had it before, we need it again. Opponents would say, really? Are we really lacking that? Cannot women do everything else except for the Eucharist? And I know I've been accused of downplaying the value of that, and I really don't feel that way. But yet, I think we do need to take a hard look at the need today and also the timing. And then it's going to be in our bishop's hands. I mean, that is the bottom line. And I don't know whether they have been discussing it. I've not heard either way. But I hope if and when they do it together.
Yeah, it could be a real problem if they don't. All right, so to all of you naysayers online right now that we accidentally, lost Father John Whiteford, guess what? Hey, Father John, my dear friend and brother priest.
Well, thank you for having me on. I've been at a bit of a disadvantage because I was coming home from my house blessing when I saw that the show was on, so I went back and started listening from the beginning. So I've been about 15 minutes behind.
Hey, but Father John, it's so good to hear your voice. We haven't spoken for a while.
Well, thank you.
Uh-oh. Did we lose him? That would not be good.
Father John, don't do this to us.
Sorry.
Please call in again. Is that Texas phone you got? Hold on, he's calling back. We got to do this, Father John. We got to show these people. Call back.
Okay, thank you.
All right, are you there?
I'm not sure what happened. All right. But I think, I'm happy to hear what you all have been saying. My only thing that I would say, and I've said in the chat, is that I think it doesn't make sense to talk about restoring the office of the diaconess or the deaconess when we're talking about people who want to have women ordained as deacons. And that's clearly what the Phoebe Center is trying to push. But I think that, the discussion has been good, and I appreciate the position that y'all have been taking. And I know both of y'all. I've never met either one of you in person, but I know you both enough from our online relationship to know that you're sincere people. So I don't think it's fair to question your intentions here.
Yeah, I mean, it's really true. There was no intention except to really, as I said, and you didn't hear the beginning of the program, but, I had Father Deacon Brian Patrick Mitchell on, and there were disagreements, and they said, well, why didn't you why didn't you have somebody from the St. Phoebe Center on? So we set this program up, but we set the program up so that there was a kind of context, right? And I think that's very, very important. We want to give them a fair shake, right? We want to, and this is Father John, and I don't know if you and I will disagree on this or not, and this is what I've been saying all along. The reality is there are many Orthodox YouTubers that bring on Protestants, Roman Catholics, atheists, and nobody says to them, oh, why are you bringing them on? You're supporting atheists, you're supporting Catholics. No, you bring somebody on so that you can discuss, so that you can answer, so that you can explain, so that you can, refute or whatever. Like, that's all this was.
And I think you've done a good job, and you had some great voices in the documentary that did a great job of batting it out of the park, like Dr. Edith Humphrey and Dr. Presbytera Eugenia Constantinou, both of whom I'm big fans of. So I appreciate the show. But I every time the subject comes up, I always make a point of making this distinction. You're not talking about restoring an office when you're talking about doing something entirely different than what that office was. And so I think that we should play that game. We should talk about you're pushing the ordination of women as deacons. And don't tell us that you want to restore something when you want to do something entirely different from what it was that you're saying you want to restore.
Yeah, I think it would be good, I know you weren't there, but sort of listen to that. And if you got 10 extra hours somewhere, listen to, all of that. Right. But the reality is, there's a lot of substance there. And I think, as I said at the beginning of the program, one of the problems is interpreting what the history says, right? So the history, like what was the nature of the deaconess? For me, here's the thing. We don't have the separation of sexes anymore. So now you're just talking about, oh, well, women need this and women need that. And I'm saying, okay, but you don't need to be a deaconess for that. That's it.
Right. And the thing is, Christ didn't ordain his mother as an apostle, and there was never a person that would have been more qualified to have been one if women were intended to serve that kind of a role. And when we look at what Christ says about the kingdom of God, the people who are the least are the ones that wind up being the greatest. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. So none of this should be viewed as some sort of a power struggle anyway. But there are reasons why Christ made that decision, and I think that we have to assume that he knew what he was doing.
Sure, absolutely. All right, John, anything?
No, just thank you, Father John, for coming on with us. Thank you for our long friendship. And, the most appealing and compelling argument that I heard today was very profoundly stated by Dr. Jeannie, and that is guard the tradition and be very protective of that and have your senses very alive on anything that might detract from that tradition of centuries. And of course, I understand our proponent friends would say, well, there is a tradition for deaconesses, and I get where you're coming from on that. But then the question has to be asked, well, why did it die, over many, many centuries ago, and you don't see that universally
right.
Any place else. So.
And what's the motivation? Amen. What's the motivation?
Right.
All right. Thanks, Father John.
One other thing I would say real quickly about the Phoebe Center is they say, well, we're not pushing for women priests. We're only talking about deaconesses. But, you say, I just want to go this far but no farther. But once you get there, then what happens? I don't trust that kind of an argument. I don't think that's where they want to stop. And some of them have openly advocated for the women being ordained as priests. So we've seen this before. The slippery slope is a real thing when you have people who intentionally grease it, and we just need to be really on guard. But I appreciate your show. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, John mentioned that he called it the camel's nose under the tent. All right, thanks, Father John. Okay, so a lot of people worked very, very hard to put this program together. Obviously, we want to thank all of our speakers for the time that they took. We want to thank John, of course, for leading the way with this particular program. We want to thank Bobby and Melinda and Trudy and Ellie and Simon and everybody that really took a lot of time to get this done. This is a kind of reboot of our show. And so you're going to look for a lot more of this, and we're going to be tackling controversial issues that, again, people are going to be asking us, why are you talking about this? We're talking about it because we want to answer it. All right. Last words, John.
Yeah, I would just encourage anyone who is serious, who's not looking for a fight, not looking to make, a case and just make, for a debate. If you want to listen to intelligent people, give their reasons why they are for or against. Go back and listen to the documentary without any other influence, or comments, chat rooms, or whatever else. Just listen, and then make decisions about where you might land, and talk to your priest and bishop about it.
Okay, we want to thank everybody. We want to thank everybody in the chat room, especially those who maybe listened and, gave us a fair shake. We appreciate you very, very much. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after it's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. And join us next Tuesday evening for an hour-long edition, not 2.5, of Ancient Faith Today. Good night, everybody.
Good night.